This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 412, Lando episode 2. On today's show, we are talking about Lando, the release cycle, and Lando 4.0 with our guest, Aaron Feledy. We'll also cover workflow participants as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Aaron Feledy. Aaron is a tireless problem solver who takes a significant interest in a wide range of technical topics. He is a co-organizer for MidCamp, the Midwest's premier Drupal camp, and he has been founded a number of Drupal camps speaking about Lando. Aaron, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello, internet friends.
And joining us as our guest host for the next 4 weeks is Andy Bloom, senior front-end developer at Lullabot.
Hello, hello.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to assign moderated content to specific users to edit or approve it before publishing? There's a module for that. It's called Workflow Participants, and it was originally created in February of 2017. It has 8.x-2.6 versions available for D8 and D9, as well as a 3.0.0 Alpha 1, which works with Drupal 9 and 10. Now, it officially says it's seeking a new maintainer, so if you feel inspired by what you hear today, maybe reach out and look into that. It currently has 17 open issues, only 3 of which are bugs, and it does have test coverage. Now, according to Drupal.org, it's currently in use by 9 Drupal websites, and it's maintained by Jay Hedstrom, who maintains a stable of modules of his own, including a number in the message stack. Now, the way Workflow Participant works is it creates a new tab on nodes, which allow a content creator or anyone with the necessary permission to assign one or more editors or reviewers. Now, they can specifically designate which roles can be editors or reviewers. You don't necessarily have to search through like all of your different users. And editors have the ability to make changes and transition content between states, while reviewers can only move the content between states. Now, for each transition in your workflow, you can specify if editors and or approvers are able to perform that transition, and it can optionally send a notification email to workflow participants as they are added to a specific piece of content. Now, I used to have a boss who liked to say the surest way to starve a dog is to put 2 people in charge of feeding it. So this idea of being able to specifically assign individuals 2 pieces of content to me seems very powerful. So let's talk about workflow participants.
Yeah, sounds great. I have a question though. Once somebody's kind of piece is done, are they able to remove themselves from notifications, or if they add themselves, they're just permanently going to get notified about the content?
So my understanding is that the way the notifications work is it only sends them an email when they first get added to a piece of content. So as the content is transitioned between states, it wouldn't necessarily automatically send additional notifications,
Okay.
Although I suspect if it's compatible with something like ECA, potentially you could, add logic to trigger additional notifications if you wanted to.
One question I have, and I may have just missed this while you were describing it, but can a user, so if a user creates a piece of content, can they define who it gets sent to, like out of a list of like, hey, these are the 5 approvers for this type of content, send it to one of them?
That's exactly the way it works. So it does that as a tab, although again, there's sort of a permission for being able to assign workflow participants. So it's kind of up to the site builder to decide whether that content creator can assign those workflow participants themselves, or whether somebody else needs to do that. I think the other thing actually I neglected to mention is it does also have a submodule which basically you can assign default participants. So you could say, anytime somebody files an event, always make this person the editor, or those kinds of things as well.
That's what I was kind of getting at there. I think a little bit was like, hey, can you default it if need be? So one type of content always goes to somebody if you don't want your users to have that much control. But that sounds very cool.
I imagine you get some really flexible configurations with this, with the incoming policy-based permissions that was pitched at Pittsburgh.
Yeah, that's another one that's very, very interesting to me around permissioning, because listen, we can go down a rabbit hole on permissioning, but you will put a link in the show notes about policy-based permissions. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, there's a lot of sort of business complexities often around sort of that whole idea of permissions and who can edit what content. So I feel like this is a great solution, but yeah, the policy-based access is definitely, I think, also an exciting innovation happening in the Drupal space right now.
Yeah, workflow is always one of the things that I kind of keep in the back of my mind as one of the strengths of Drupal. I find that not a lot of projects need it, and the projects that ask for it usually don't need it either. But the projects that do actually need it need a lot of it usually. And if you didn't have something like workflow and the workflow ecosystem and these types of tools, I don't even know how to begin building it. It's so complex to have that extra layer, but Drupal handle, since Drupal 7 has handled it really well.
It's very interesting too. Like permission granularity is something that is like, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's evolving or if it's just always been there and I've never really had a need for it. But like, I feel like the more complex projects get, the more granularity you need over those permissions and those workflows and who can do what and when. And I think all of the stuff we've just been talking about kind of helps to make that system better.
Yep. One last question for you, Martin. Does this tie in? Do you know if this ties in at all to that preview module that you use on your blog for sharing content? Because I think that'd be an interesting use case if you were able to say, like, I need this person to look at it. They don't have an account. They need to preview it, but I need them to approve it. That'd be a...
So I feel like those are probably different use cases. The preview unpublished, I think that's the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's really about saying, I want to be able to give people who aren't users in the system the ability to come in and review something before it's published, whereas workflow participants is really about assigning people who are users to have sort of additional permissions in terms of being able to push things through the workflow, potentially with the ability to make changes as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna hack that for you, Nick, and say like you could create a user with the email for the person. They could get an emailed link to the unpublished thing that they need to review, but then there's really no way for them to approve it to move it to the next step of the workflow, right? So,
yeah, I mean the use case I was thinking of is that bigger projects always have something like this. The upper level stakeholder that doesn't have the time to log in but still wants to review a particular piece of content. So if you combine those two, like they have the ability to approve it, but they don't have to have an account and remember it to log in. I mean, I think it's kind of narrow, but those types of projects always have issues. But
yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe there's a way to use something like content moderation link along with accessed unpublished to sort of give that senior stakeholder the ability to potentially move something between states. But I feel like you'd want to be pretty careful about permissions so that it doesn't become a way that anybody with the link, suddenly is able to push content between states.
Wait a second. This might be a twofer today. What does content moderation link do?
So content moderation link creates basically a token that you can use to push a piece of content between different workflow states. So you could say, as an example, as part of the email notification that goes out using something like Workbench email, or even your ECA notifications if you're using that, include basically a link that would say, as an editor, I can look at this, maybe see that, oh, well, John knows what he's talking about on this subject, so I don't need to review it. I can just tap this link and that'll go and directly, move that content to published as
Oh.
an example.
Well, there you go. That solves your problem right there, Nick. Just send them 2 links in the email, one to the preview that they need to look at, and the other one to say, once you agree with it, click here and send it on to the next phase.
That works.
There you go. No logins.
Definitely works.
Life made
Yeah.
easier with Drupal.
Well, I'll say the potential complication of that scenario is that currently content moderation link does rely on user permissions. So it wouldn't, by nature of having the link, you would still need to sort of like log in and have the permission to perform that transition. So it doesn't override that, but maybe that's a feature that could be added.
Oh boy. This feels like we could just talk about this for the next 30 minutes.
I love these little discussions, and you're finding really interesting modules to talk about. So I appreciate that. Well, thank you, Martin. As always, another interesting module to talk about, and on to our primary topic. So Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with Lando?
Yeah, my name's Aaron Feledy. I call myself a hands-on architect. I kind of get to invent my role over and over again because I'm a bit of an independent contractor. I can come and work for just about anybody and wear whatever hat you need. But the primary thing I work on is Drupal and integrations with other systems, APIs, DevOps, that sort of thing. And I've been doing that for I've been doing the contract work for 15 years, and about 10 years ago, I decided to go all in on Drupal and kind of be like, I'm a Drupal person. If you want to hire me, I'm gonna work on Drupal in some fashion. So through that process of contracting with various organizations and what have you, I've seen a lot of the ways that people do things and the way organizations do things, and there are lots of patterns in the approaches and whatnot. And at some point along the way, I contracted with Calamuna, and at the time they were developing an internal tool called Calabox, which was a wrapper around Docker, and it eventually became Lando. But back then, I fell in love with it right away because I've always been a Windows guy. I did everything on Windows. I went to school to be a Windows sysadmin. And so, this thing where everything is well, nothing works with Windows is really how it came down to it. And now here's this tool where I don't have to set up a fresh VM every time I get on a new project. I could just spin it up and define my details. It was a little limited back then, but I could get in there and mess around with the Docker files and make it do what I wanted. So it became the tool I used all the time, and from kind of hacking it to make it do what I wanted, I kind of learned the internals, and before I knew it, people were asking me questions about Lando, so I just kind of rolled with that too. And now I go around, I talk about Lando at the Drupal camps, and I contribute to Lando, and sort of people come up to me, hey, it's the Lando guy. I'm like, well, I'm a Drupal guy. So yeah, Lando. Okay.
You mentioned that you're a Windows guy, which
a whole line of questions there. Go for it.
I used to be a Windows guy until about 11 years ago. I switched to Linux. I'm curious if you're still on Windows and why you continue on Windows when Linux is an option.
So the great part about Windows as of late is Windows or Linux is now included, right? The ability to run Linux with WSL2, the Windows subsystem for Linux, which basically it makes Linux almost a first-class citizen in the Windows environment. They've done a lot of work to integrate things so you can still have your Windows experience while also having all the Linux tools just right there. And they've made it so the networking just sort of works, the file sharing just sort of works, and it mostly feels transparent on the Windows side. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, now I have everything but the GUI for Linux. on my Windows machine. So that sort of that took a lot of the headaches away as far as development, because the internet's built on Linux. So
I want to shift focus here a little bit to Nick and ask him how that makes him feel.
I mean, if you're relying on a tool to make something like Linux, still have the question, why not just use Linux? But I mean, people have preferences for environment, and if you want to use Windows, you can use Windows. There's no,
Because can you run Windows on your machine?
I can't. I could if I installed it.
And the other
Right.
problem is I run into just as much, anytime I'm going to run Ubuntu on my laptop, solely for a while. And, I find that, about 10% of my working hours are spent fiddling with something that on Windows, I just didn't have to fiddle with. It just worked.
Interesting.
I mean, once I've got stuff set up, I haven't had to fiddle in a long time, but occasionally updates break things.
I'm a fiddler to a fault. So if I'm fiddling with something to get it working, it's because I did something to break it.
I prefer the term fine tuner, but hey, whatever works. I would also like to put a programming note in here that this show might be difficult for Nick as a Linux user and an avid DDev user and supporter, but he's gonna stick it through with us and provide quality content. I'm sure. So, Aaron, I realize that we may have buried the lead a little bit here for some folks. Like, we're very much assuming that everybody knows what Lando is. Can you, for those folks who may not know what Lando is or does, can you kind of just give a very, very high level overview of that?
Yeah. So Lando is a tool to sort of manage the dependencies that come along with software development, primarily web development. By dependencies, I mean in the case of Drupal, you need to be running PHP, you need to be running a server like a database server like MySQL, and depending on what kind of development you're doing, maybe that means Node as well. And as you go from project to project, these things require different versions, or they have different stacks. It's not PHP, it's something else, and you're running Go, all sorts of different ways you can develop things. And what Lando does is it tries to make it so that it's very easy to jump from one thing to the next without having to manage those dependencies. They sort of are defined with the project that you're working on, and then you can just type Lando start into your command line, and all of those things that I described get downloaded, get set to the right versions, and are just there for you to use. And it just wraps all that up into a nice little package, and that's sort of the goal of Lando, is just to make managing all that very easy. And as a developer, if someone else has already set it up for your project, like you shouldn't have to think about these things anymore. It's the purpose.
Right. It makes like the use or need for virtual machines, right, almost non-existent, right? It's using it kind of built on Docker and kind of managing Docker containers for your development environment. Which, you're right. If you have, you're coming into an existing project, you have Lando set up, you can pretty much say Lando start, and everything will get built out for you. Predefined by the Lando configuration file that's in your repo, right? I think another aspect here is a lot of service providers offer recipes for Lando. So like there are different providers out there that you can basically, when you set up Lando, use their recipes to be able to kind of get all of the components of your environment in your local, if you have like a caching layer or a Redis server or something like that, you can kind of build those into your local environment. So definitely pretty powerful. Long gone are the days of like MAMP, I feel, and not that there's anything wrong with using that. There are folks out there still doing it. I'm just saying, like, This is like next generation.
So something that John said, I have a question. What is the difference between a Docker container and a virtual machine? Because I assumed the two were the same thing.
The way containers work is they were based on a concept that exists within Linux, where basically you get to the way processes interact, and basically the way the permissions work is you could isolate what you're doing in Linux in a way where other parts of Linux can't see it. So the concept of a container is, okay, here's this basically this setup of reserved space for permissions and whatnot that can't see anything else. And what that could look like is a small version of Linux running a PHP server and MySQL and all of that, and it doesn't affect anything else but that little sort of environment. And it's not a virtual machine; it's still running Linux as it is. There is some overlap here. You do get some virtual machine things. So let me say what a virtual machine. Virtual machine is basically an emulation of another computer running on top of the computer you're already running. So with that, you get a lot of overhead. You're not running Linux directly. You're running a program that thinks it's Linux, basically, or Windows or whatever else.
Yeah, I would just break in and say one of the biggest differences, the way I think about it, is a virtual machine has to have an operating system installed on it,
Right.
like Windows, Linux, or something else. The container is, I mean, again, this is a gross oversimplification, but the container is just the program that you need. So a container will use a lot of the resources of the host machine, like shared across all the containers in a way that they can, whereas the virtual machine is essentially its own encapsulated computer. So a Docker container that's running PHP or something might only need 50 megabytes of memory or something. You need to have all the memory requirements of whatever OS you're running as well in the virtual machine. So if Linux requires 2 gigabytes and you need 50 for PHP, then you need 2 gigabytes plus 50 megabytes for the virtual machine, but you only need 50 for Docker. So Docker is way more efficient.
So yeah, so it's unless you get into a situation where you're not running Linux on your host machine. Now you have an issue where, okay, these concepts I just talked about, the way a container works, where it's you taking advantage of the ability for Linux to sort of sandbox things. But you can't do that on a Mac, and you can't do that on Windows. So the workaround for that is to install a Linux virtual machine, which comes with all of the overhead of the full operating system stack run within its own process on top of everything else you're running. So
at that point, you're running a container on a virtual machine.
Right.
Okay. Okay. So then you were talking about, in your description of what Lando is, talking about running different stacks, whether that's PHP and MySQL, or whether that's a Node stack, or I imagine you could do like .NET or Java if you wanted to. Is there any specific kind of development or site Lando works best for?
I don't think so. I'd say it's most popular amongst PHP CMS developers, primarily because that's just sort of it came out of Calamuna, which was a Drupal agency, and just sort of it grew in popularity within the Drupal space, and then kind of spread into the PHP space. And for the longest time, it's been able to work on all of these other frameworks as well. But it's just the adoption and the word of mouth kind of made it the big tool for PHP things. But I don't know that it's best suited for one versus the other, though. I think it works pretty well. I just was on a project that was primarily Go for the past year. It was running Go and MongoDB and all that, and it was a great environment for that.
So it's pretty flexible. You can run a lot of different things on it. It's not like, oh, you have to run just a Linux box, or just you can do a lot of different things. That actually leads me to a question, and you might be able to answer this being a lover of the Windows. Do you have the ability to kind of like spin up like an IIS sort of environment in Lando?
Yep. Yeah, I believe that's there's a .NET recipe that basically is that.
That
Interesting.
sounds painful, but that's
Well,
I'm not
we
used
can
to it
get
myself.
we can get very meta there if you're running Windows desktop and then you install Lando to run IIS. That feels very like a box within a box within a box to me. But hey, what do I know?
Don't let me talk about my whole stack here. Windows WSL2 to run Docker, to work with Lando, to run Apache.
Yeah, it can get deep. So I shifting gears a little bit here. We have a listener question from Steven. He's going to ask we're asking a little bit about some of the features of Lando now. So Steven had been kind of a advocate for Lando and user of Lando for many years, but found recently he had to switch to DDEV because DDEV just supports Kulima and Mutagen a little bit better for Mac. He's curious if Lando has plans to address those gaps, or if kind of DDEV is the way to go for that for now.
So there are plans to address those gaps. They're in the works. Lando has been undergoing a bit of a rewrite, a refactor, to make it easier for those things going forward to be. The tool was originally built to be a Docker tool. Like it was built for Docker, and so it's in the process of being reworked so that it can work with anything, and it's also going to be plugin driven. So if the next thing that comes around, it doesn't exist yet, but it's great. It's a plugin. You can tell Lando, okay, orchestrate this new environment instead. Yeah, that's in the works. It's coming soon. I mean, it's been coming soon for a while. It's taking some time, but it's happening.
So that kind of leads me to my next question around Lando's release schedule. And I'm wondering, as a longtime Lando user, I'm wondering why the release schedule seems so sporadic. I mean, the last release was in May, which wasn't that long ago, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the spontaneity of the releases, and if there is like a release schedule that they're trying to map to.
So for a while now, the during this rewrite that I mentioned, the refactor, the new features portion of it has been kind of, we're going to put this in the new version. No sense in writing a new thing for the thing we're discarding. There's a new way to write these plugins and whatnot, and these interactions within Lando. We're going to put them there. Problem with that, the refactor is taking some time, like I said. So we're not really seeing the new features come out because it's we're not building them for the way Lando is now. So what you're seeing is releases more for bug fixes that are affecting the users. Because otherwise Lando's pretty stable. 99. I don't have the metrics in front of me, but 99% of the time, it does what it's supposed to do for the people that are using it. So right now, the Lando 3 is the one that everyone has been using. Lando 3 is just basically maintenance fixes only for the most part. But actually, that's not true because recently, some of these Lando 4 things that have been working on, because it has been taking some time to refactor, they're getting backported into Lando 3. And some sort of basically there's some adapters being built into the old code to allow them to work with some of the new things, so that we can start more easily backporting some of the new features in. So the expectation is that you're going to start seeing more releases now in Lando 3 with some of the new features, the ones that make sense to backport, while Lando 4 continues to be developed. And Lando 4, then the idea is that the whole ecosystem is going to be much easier to work with as a contributor. It's pretty difficult right now. It's the nature of the way Lando kind of came up. It didn't lend itself well to contribution, but that's the idea of Lando 4 is make it much easier, get a lot of contrib in, start churning through releases.
Yeah, so let's dive into that a little bit. Actually, I'm curious about what the development process is like, because when you're using Lando, you're developing a site. So to test Lando, presumably you have to have sites to test with, and you need to figure things out. So what is the development, if you're looking to contribute to Lando, what does that process look like, and how do you test features when it's a development environment itself?
So, and I do this because I'm like I said, a Windows person. I never it didn't Windows doesn't come with PHP like Linux, a Linux distro might, right? So I kind of made it a habit. I never install anything on my computer. I did do it all in Lando, right? I don't have nodes not installed, PHP's not installed. I have no versions of any of these things on my machine. But I do have Node installed because to develop for Lando, it is written in JavaScript. You have to be able to run Node to run it, debug it, test it. So yeah, you basically it's written in JavaScript. You can work on it in any IDE that works with JavaScript. And then it's like I said, it's Node. Any IDE, or you run an npm command to run or build it, much like you would on some front end things for a website.
So do you have to because it kind of takes over some routing stuff too, do you have to power off Lando each time you make a change, or the most changes kind of one of the nice things about Lando and working in Drupal is you make a change, you refresh the page, it's there. But I imagine with Lando, it's a little bit more complex than that. Or is it kind of that same cycle? You kind of rebuild it and it's there and working, and you can test your changes.
So I can kind of equate this to how it works in web development, where you have your UI and then you have your back end. And and if you're doing something that requires, like in Drupal, if you're doing something that changes the schema for the config, you may have to uninstall your module and reinstall it to get the effects to really go through the process and make sure your changes are working. But if you're just tweaking the position of a box, you might be able to refresh the page, and that sort of works the same in Lando, to where if you're changing something more on the schema level, in the background, what Lando's doing, it's leveraging Docker, so it's generating Docker compose files, which define all the containers in the environment. It's doing that behind the scenes. So if you're doing backend things, maybe you need to kind of tear down and rebuild to kind of see how it builds back up in Docker. But then there's also the front end, which is your CLI. You're typing your Lando commands into your CLI. You may be able to tweak those interactions that don't really have an effect on the environment. So you can just run, you just run, you can just click the play button in PHP Storm in your Node environment, and it's just okay, well, it prompted me, or I just type a Lando command now, right? And it actually will interface with that Docker environment that was already built, could have been built by just the fully packaged version of Lando.
Okay.
So yeah, it depends on which part you're working on.
And for our listeners, CLI is command line interface. Mm-hmm. Just throwing that out there.
So if you're writing Lando code, if you're contributing to Lando, you're writing JavaScript. Does that mean if I want to run Lando on my machine, do I need to have Node installed to do that, or is it compile to something else?
So if you really want to make it easy on yourself, you should have Node installed on your machine, because then you're just using the Node runtime. You don't have to deal with building and such. But when if you do want to package it up, it runs on drawing a blank. It's a Vercel package that basically wraps your JavaScript. It's not really compiling. It's just wrapping it. Like you can actually, if you want to dig in with a hex editor at the Lando binary, you'll see a whole bunch of JavaScript in plain text in there. So it's not really doing anything. It's wrapping it up in something that can be run. Your actual node is packaged into a binary along with all the Lando code, and that's actually what you're running when you run Lando.
So this may be getting a little into the weeds. Are you working with a specific Node version? Because I believe Node, I think it's 20, is supposed to come with the ability to create a binary just in Node. Is that something that you or anyone working on Lando has looked into?
I haven't, and I don't know if anyone has. And I can't remember off the top of my head which version of Node we're currently running. It's a Lando file for me.
Do you use Lando for your development environment?
I have, but it ended up being more complicated than it was worth. I tried. It's like I was saying, it feels so clean to not have anything installed on my machine. It's just, it's specific to each project. It just kind of comes in built in Lando. And I tried and it works, but it's just too many layers of abstraction and complication.
Running Docker within Docker is complicated.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Okay, so what are some of your favorite features of Lando?
Well, my favorite is the ability to just set everything up. Well, see, I'm my eternal tinkerer. I can't set everything up once and forget it, but I can have the idea in my head that I'm going to set this up once, distribute it to a team of people, and all they have to do is type Lando start, and they're also all set up to go. That's great. There's no figuring, what's different about your situation? What do we? How do you get set up? The time you might spend going through the docs to get the environment set up just right. Like, you just Lando start. Love that. And even coming back to a project later, I haven't looked at the thing in a year and a half. Lando start. I'm there.
Yeah.
Love that. Otherwise, tooling is great. It seems simple. What do you do? And you're running a series of bash commands every time you type a Lando command, a custom Lando command. But you can set up your own custom Lando commands. So like right now, you type Lando start, it builds and sets up your environment. But you can define your own command. So you can say Lando build, for example, and then you can type in all of the. Maybe you got a composer command, composer install that runs, and then you've got a yarn install that runs on a different container, and then you've got an npm build for some reason, because I don't know why you have yarn also, but you got all these things, and maybe you're copying and moving files around, and you can just anything you might stick in a script, or you can even run a script. Got a script in your project, you can just say Lando build, and it runs all of these different things. It's like a task runner for you, right?
Sounds like your favorite thing is the ability to be highly customizable, which is nice.
Yes. True. At the end of the day, I think that's what it comes down to. You can sort of build this thing that makes working on whatever project it is very easy. And as those needs change from project to project, you can sort of define what is my tooling, what is my environment, and then the end user just gets all that. By end user, I mean the other developers on your team after you set this up. There it is.
Yeah. It also works. Go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, I was just going to say, even on a individual project basis, when things like upgrading PHP versions used to be, never mind switching between projects, if you're going from 8.0 to 8.1 and you're using WAMP or MAMP or something, like that's a much bigger task. Whereas in Lando or DDev, you just change a value in one of the YAML files and restart or rebuild the project, and now you can test that new version. And once that's tested, setting aside updating upstream environments and stuff, just handing that off to other developers is as simple as just pushing that branch. And on bigger projects, especially, that's really valuable because you might not be maintaining all the different custom modules. If other people need to run updates on their own custom module, that's an easy way to get them the updated environment to run their own tests and processes.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that one of the benefits you get with Lando, maybe 5-ish lines of config in your Lando config file, you can actually be running 2 versions of PHP at the same time with 2 different URLs. You can kind of jump back and forth if you're working on like upgrading something or whatnot.
Yeah, one other thing I've done is, or seen done is use in a CI/CD process, right, to run tests before you kind of like deploy a site or make a change, right? You can spin up Lando within your CI/CD process to test that stuff end to end to ensure that your code quality is good. So many different uses there, which is awesome. I'm wondering if we can dig a little bit more into Lando's kind of big 4.0 release. We talked a little bit about it. It's kind of as I understand it, a complete rewrite, going to kind of more of a plugin based system. I'm wondering, like, what else can users expect from that 4.0 release?
It is going to get it's already pretty powerful and customizable. It is going to get so much more so. Right now, it's sort of it's a wrapper around Docker Compose. It gives you some access into that. And you can, if you really want to get down into the details, it does expose the Docker Compose, most of the Docker Compose API, so you can actually get in there and really define what your PHP container is doing in any level of granularity that you could with Docker Compose. But it's the Docker Compose API, and you gotta go in there and kind of line things up. with Lando 4, one of the big things is the Lando API, the config API, the YAML that you're typing into your Lando config file is going to be updated with it's going basically Docker Compose is going to be part of the Lando API instead of you just sort of sticking it in this one spot is the way it currently works. It'll become now, as you're defining your config for a container service in Lando, you can go, okay, well, I want this one thing that I can do in Docker Compose. Well, that's just available there as a sort of first class citizen in your definition. But also, so is just the Docker API for containers, like your env, your copy, the stuff you see when you're looking at a Docker file. Those are going to be options for any service as well. And if you include those in there, it will actually build the container right there, or build the Docker file right there before it builds the container. So that's been a pain point for a lot of people. So you need to have a container that exists. You're starting from there, then you're running commands on it every time you build. Or now you can kind of define some things that go into the actual definition of the container. So you can pre-build everything in that you want, that maybe you would do in a build step now. Sort of that becomes the base level. So now every time you do a Lando rebuild, all that stuff's already in there for you. And maybe you distribute that or whatnot, because it will actually build your Docker file. Yeah, just making it much easier to develop and contribute. Documentation is going to be huge. That's already in process, documenting all these things. Right now, the documentation is like, well, how do I actually contribute? If you do find something, it may not be right, and that's sort of going to become a front and center. This is here it is. This is how it works. Everything's plugin driven. We're going you make your own thing if it doesn't exist. Real easy.
Is there a roadmap that kind of lays out all these things?
If you go to the Lando website, there's a blog section, and there's a post in there sort of laying out some of these things. A lot of the detail in that is just been kind of buried in conversation rather than displayed out anywhere. But there is a blog post sort of laying out that roadmap.
And when can we expect 4.0? Is it like, I know it's when it's ready, right? But is it 2 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years? Like what kind of timeline do you think?
Current chatter mixed with what I think, I'd say probably by the end of the year.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the big features is going to be all of the Docker APIs they become part of the Lando API, but it is in no way reliant on Docker anymore. You can swap things out. If you come up with some other solution that doesn't use any type of containers at all, but can still kind of make sense of all these configs you set up, you could build a plugin and have it run on that engine.
That raises another question, right? Will 4.0 support other backends as opposed to Docker? Like from the go? Yeah.
From the go. Yep.
I found the roadmap looking blog post, and one of them I'm seeing right now is also support for Apple Silicon. So that'll help update people that are on Macs that have come out in the last 2 years or so.
Yeah, and then that's in there to some degree already. You do, it's, you know, if the container that Lando is using for a particular service supports it, then it does. Lando doesn't build its own containers, so it's if the container supports it, it does. And that Lando 4 is also going to change and use all of the official Docker containers. And as far as I know, those all, you know, at least recent versions all support Apple Silicon.
I mean, I'll just be happy if I can keep, like, I can stop getting the Docker update box. Like, if I can just keep Docker up to date so it stops prompting me to update, that would be a huge win for my productivity.
Yeah, and there's going to be some changes around testing, automated testing, and making it easier to manually test things as well. To hopefully and also possibly make it so that Lando doesn't expect a certain version of Docker so much. And that way, yeah, it shouldn't matter what version you're running most of the time. Hopefully, it's hard because that Docker, they change things, and if you update, it can break stuff.
Yeah.
So a question I would have then, I know at least for myself, when I pick a tool and I start using it, and if I don't have a reason to change, I don't go looking for a reason to change. Why would someone move to Lando over some other local development environment, whether that's something that's also Docker based or something that's not like a MAMP?
It's always been, I think, the customizability. You can it does so much. You can do so much, and that's just going to get so much more powerful. You know, coming soon. That, you know, if you need that, if you want that, that's, you know, that's definitely a big selling point. And the hope is that with the opening things up, making it easier for contribution, that the feature set is going to grow significantly through third-party plugins and contributed plugins. And it's just going. The hope is that it is just, it's going to do anything you need. So
It's interesting. It's interesting you asked that question, Andy, because recently, Nick and I have been working on with some other folks, have been working on the New England Drupal Camp website, the new New England Drupal Camp website, and I started it with Lando because that's where, you know, to that point where I'm like, I know Lando, I'm just gonna go Lando. It's like easy. I used a recipe and we were off and running. Then some development teams came in using Lando, and then Nick actually converted it or added DDev to it. And when I went back in there, I was having a hard time getting Lando to do what it was supposed to be doing after other teams had kind of developed in there. And I just kind of switched over to DDev, and I was like, DDev start. And it just kind of worked. And I was like, oh, all right, this is pretty easy. Like, I kind of see the similarities. So it's interesting to try to draw those parallels because, you know, people aren't necessarily always, you know, trying the latest and greatest thing just because they're, you know, sticking with what they know.
So I'm curious about Lando adoption. I think the last time we had a Lando show, we had Mike on, and he talked about kind of some explosive growth. It's been a couple of years now, and I think it's been pretty much on 3x for that amount of time. I'm curious about growth and adoption of Lando. Are you still seeing kind of exponential growth? Has it leveled off? You know, how many people are using Lando? What do you think about that?
So I don't have as much insight into the metrics as Mike would have, but anecdotally, it seems to still be growing. I do see, you know, some of those other tools, like you mentioned. Hey, the DDev sort of just worked, right? I do see a lot of adoption of those, but I think the adoption of these kinds of tools in general is growing still. So they're going up, and I think with the next version of Lando, we're gonna cut into the dev market a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do see these things as kind of like ebbs and flows, right? So like, feels right now that, like, you know, unfortunately, Lando might be in like a little bit of a valley, right? But when 4.0 comes out, like, I think we may see maybe another peak where folks are like, oh, look at this, it's all, you know, it's pluggable and it you can work with other backends, and like, it doesn't make my Mac burst into flames and like, things like that, like will move people back in that flow, I think. We're actually ending the show with 2 more listener questions, which is super exciting to me. This one's actually not for you, Aaron. It's actually for Nick. Stephen was actually wondering, Nick, you were using Lando. You were a Lando user for a long time. And then you switched to DDev, and it seems like you've never looked back. I'm wondering why you made that switch, and if you'd ever maybe go back to using Lando.
So I'm happy to kind of talk about why I made that switch, and I'll give you some feedback, Aaron, of some of the things that if I were to switch back, I would absolutely want to see in Lando. I will say I use Linux, which in my opinion is the correct operating system for developers to use. So a lot of this, a lot of this stuff didn't actually affect me, but probably the biggest reason I switched was a lot of my clients insist on using Mac. And around the time that M1 came out, I mean, Mac had, not to dive too far into the weeds, but Mac provides an additional 2 layers between the file system and Docker. And that's one of the reasons why Docker-based environments on Macs are slow. And that seemed to get a fair bit worse with M1, but M1 also provided mutagen support. And so for a lot of my clients using Mac, once that differentiator came, it made sense to look at it. So I kind of got tired of doing kind of Mac support just to kind of try to tweak the settings to get it a little bit more performant. And so that purely isn't a Lando thing. That's a Mac thing. But once mutagen support came out, I tested it and it worked for the clients that used Mac that had M1s. And I didn't, I'm a solo freelancer. I didn't want to support both Lando and DDev, even though I know they're, as long as you don't have them both running at the same time, they're compatible. So I just made the switch to DDev. Now that I've been using DDev for a couple of years, the things that I would love to see, aside from mutagen support, DDev has a command for launch and launch-p and launch-m. So with Lando, whenever I need to see PHP my admin, I either have to set up an alias myself, or I have to kind of look at the info and find out what the port is and go directly to that port. With DDev, if I want to see PHP my admin, I just type in DDev launch-p and it opens a browser with it. Or if I want to open Mailhog, it just opens it automatically. So that kind of functionality where like out of the box, I can just launch a particular front end that I need to see. Like that's pretty handy. I use that fairly often. Xdebug, I know Xdebug is supported in Lando, but I found it was very inconsistent. It would occasionally just not work for weeks at a time, and then it would start working again. It's been consistent for DDev. And then finally, the one that you already mentioned, Aaron, is Docker updates. I use Docker extensively outside of DDev for things, and being locked to a specific version. I found there was also a complication on clients because I found, for example, clients should not install Docker beforehand. They should install Lando and let Lando handle installing Docker, which I think for a lot of people was a convenience. But as a tinkerer myself, I found that to be a pain point. But I mean, both are great. I mean, my main thing is you should not be running MAMP or WAMP. Lando's a great tool.
Whoa. If you want to
In
run
this
MAMP or WAMP, like that's your choice.
It's your choice. I would say you'll get a huge amount of benefit for using a system like Lando or DDev or Doxel. Having a way to quickly restart or reset environments and import a fresh database or something, or I think one thing that Lando does a little bit better than DDev is, and DDev does provide integrations with these tools, but I think the way that recipes work with like Pantheon or Platform, or I assume Platform is now supported. It wasn't when I was using it about a year and a half ago, but
that's the one I tried to use before I had to switch over to DDev when in that example I gave earlier. So I don't know. Maybe it was just user error, but anyway.
I think it's because you're probably using the Pantheon recipe, and switching recipes is always more complex than starting with a recipe. But anyway, Lando's kind of the thinking behind the recipe system, I think, makes those types of updates a little bit simpler. Although DDEV supports all that and is documented. So it's not really a feature that Lando has that DDEV doesn't. I think just the idea behind the recipes makes it a little bit clearer. But yeah, that's the main reason why I made the switch initially wasn't because Lando was missing something. It was that my clients insisted on using Macs, and the performance was significantly better.
It always goes back to the hating on Max for Nick. I don't know. Every show, we always come back to that one salient point.
It's definitely not hate. It's just that why wait 30 minutes for a process when it can take 45 seconds, right? And I think Windows, especially with WSL2, right, is similar performance to Linux nowadays. I think it's a little bit slower, but like,
to be fair,
10
I have
10 or
never
15
waited
seconds.
30 minutes for Lando on a Mac to do anything.
On a fresh composer install,
Maybe 20 seconds, or maybe 30 seconds, or maybe even a minute if I'm installing a large site from the the ground up. But
especially since moving to Apple Silicon.
Just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those things are getting addressed in the new version of Lando. Some of the expectation is going to be that it will be through Contrib, because one of the things, the target audience isn't necessarily to someone who just wants to spin up a project this one time and run a few things. It is more for a team that somebody sets it up for everyone else kind of situation.
Yep.
But that like I said, Contrib things could easily make it to where there's a nice little package thing where you get all the cool little features that work great if you're a Drupal developer. There'll be nothing stopping anybody from building that. And yeah, what things like you mentioned, it's Docker and Mac working together is sort of a difficult thing. But anywhere that can be improved upon, it is getting improved upon in the new versions of things. So it's yeah, I think a lot of what you said, all the things you said are definitely topics that are in discussion and being addressed. So,
and it's great because once 4.0 comes out and there's a kind of more of an open source contribution based structure, Nick can air his grievances and tickets and then fix them.
I don't have grievances. I mean, I appreciate Lando. Lando was so. I don't know if you know. Before I move on to the last question, Aaron, I don't know if you know this, but maybe 6 months before Lando came out, I built my own, working with one of my clients, my own like Docker Compose wrapper tool set. And then because I was using Docker, it's just a hipster moment. I was using Docker before it was cool. No, but I had a particular client that had a few different environments. We needed some flexibility. So we built that system, and we were talking about releasing it to the community, and Lando came out, and I was like, well, there's no need for us to release this. Lando does everything. Like, because one thing I hadn't built in was like traffic and kind of the routing stuff. That was like the next task. I was like, Lando already built it. It's already, why not just use that and support that? And I used Lando for many years after that. But yeah, no, Lando was great. It's just that, I don't have a problem with Lando. I just reinstalled my computer and don't happen to have it anymore. But yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to 4.0 and kind of seeing what's changed. Oh, one thing that I do like that DDEV does provide this, but I feel like Lando makes it. I like the way Lando did it too, is the custom commands, like you mentioned, the build like tool set. I found myself in Lando anytime I had to do something, just writing a custom command, and you don't have to restart Lando for the custom command to take effect. So I found that release cycle clean, and I enjoyed it. DDEV does provide custom commands. You write them in Bash, so it's kind of the same thing. But I don't know, just something about with DDEV, you have to know what container you're running it on and put that there. Where with Lando, you just kind of define that in the YAML, the single YAML place. And so I kind of prefer that method, but that's something that I kind of miss. Okay, so
definitely on my favorite features list.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's one of the big things I missed. So we have a final listener question from Matthew. He asked on Slack. He wants to know he wants some advice from you maybe on how to best sell Lando to his team. So he uses Lando. The rest of his team doesn't use a Docker-based environment like this. Well, sorry, they use Docker, but they use a custom Docker environment. They don't use I guess, semi-managed Lando environment. And he's facing some pushback in trying to convince his team to use Lando. So he's curious if you have any specific feedback that can help, you know, give the benefits of a defined environment like Lando.
I think the biggest thing, like we were just talking about tooling, being able to just, especially if you have specific instances where you can say, wow, like, wouldn't it be great if we had a command that did this and a command that did that? And you probably already do, but they're in scripts that somebody has to go find and know how to run. Or now you can have this prepackaged thing that all of it is prepackaged. It's in Lando. You run Lando start, you run your Lando build or whatever it might be. I'd say if you could sell anything like that, then hey, just you don't have to know about the scripts anymore. You just run your command. And then another big thing is that you don't have to be technically savvy once you've done all that. So you can take somebody they're a QA person that really is looking at the front end of your product. They may not know how to really do anything on the back end, but you can expose some of these things that maybe were in scripts and make it easy for them. Hey, run Lando start, run this Lando build command, and now you can do all your QA things, or project management. They can, you can have other people work with it. It makes it even easier for them. Yeah, I think those are probably the two big things that I typically run into.
I think one thing that comes to my mind that listening to you, Aaron, and Nick talking about kind of Lando or DDev, right, is like with Lando, like you just said it, right? With a Lando YAML file, right? I can put in a service for Mailhog. I can put in a service for PHPMyAdmin. I can build a database server, and I can say, hey, rebuild this, and it'll spin up all those environments using kind of predefined smart defaults, if you will, and they're all interconnected. Like I can go and I can get from one to the other very easily. Like I don't necessarily have to take Docker files and move them around and like kind of wire them together and do all of that stuff. So I think, for me, that's a real big win as far as like, hey, it's going to be a lot quicker for you to take this one Lando file, get Lando start, and for all of those environments to be created and configured the way they are. I just thought of this, is like you also have the ability to mimic your production environment through your Lando configuration too, right? So if you have a very specific production environment you want to make sure that you're testing for, like you can duplicate that in your Lando configuration. Now, granted, you could do that with Docker files, but again, I imagine there's probably a good amount of wiring that has to happen there.
And that's it too. The people that maintain those Docker setups, a lot of that maintenance and whatnot is the wiring between it, the routing, the things like that. That just comes with Lando. It's built in. Nobody has to maintain that anymore.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up. Like, especially if you're adding a new service, like let's say you're adding Elasticsearch or something, right? You just need to add the Elasticsearch container to Lando, and the networking is kind of handled. The shares are handled. The volumes are handled. You don't have to like worry about exposing all that information to all the other containers that need to know about it. Whereas if you're managing kind of a Docker Compose file yourself, you need to. Or worse yet, if you're really just kind of building a monolith, which I'm not saying that his team does this, but a lot of teams that manage their own Docker environment just install everything in one Docker container. Like that's, you're kind of missing the true strength of Docker if you're doing that. And Lando kind of splits everything out kind of for you automatically.
That's also a lot of cases not really mimicking the development or production environments that you're living on either. Like, your hosting provider isn't putting all the services in one box, right?
Well, depends how big the site is, but medium. And if you're using something like Aqua or Pantheon or Platform, right, they're generally doing container-based
right
systems too. So, well, Aaron, thank you for joining us and kind of giving in this update on Lando. It's been a while since we've had a Lando member on to kind of talk through it. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Do you have questions or feedback? reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter, or the social network formerly known as Twitter, with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. Okay, as we get ready to close out the show, Aaron, if our listeners had questions for you, comments, or thoughts, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
You can find me I'm on LinkedIn, Aaron Feledy. If I post some things on Twitter every once in a while. I'm sorry, the social media network formerly known as Twitter. It's a symbol now, I believe. It's Aaron Feledy there as well, no space. And then on Drupal Slack, Lando Slack, and anywhere else, I'm Arrow.
And Andy, how about you?
I'm Andy-Bloom in most places, and if the username doesn't allow hyphens, it's usually an underscore or two. I do still have a Twitter account. However, I have abandoned it for a few months now, and I'm mostly on the Drupal.community Mastodon instance. And you can find me there at Andy_Bloom.
John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Mastodon and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.
Bye.